Hello, my name is Tim Stephenson.
And I'm Nicha Stapanukul.
We are both doctoral students and student teachers at Indiana University Jacobs School of Music. We want to thank you so much for joining us today. We would also like to thank everyone at MTNA for making this conference possible and hosting this session about effective language for different age groups.
Do you find yourself gravitating towards a certain age group in your studio? Could it be that you have gotten used to teaching a certain way and might find branching out to be a little uncomfortable?
When I first started teaching, I had almost exclusively adult students, and I felt really insecure about taking on younger kids for piano lessons. I felt like I wasn't going to say the right thing or make lessons interesting enough for them. So I avoided teaching children for a while because of this.
And I have a similar experience, but when I started teaching, I had exclusively young students, so I quickly became comfortable teaching them. But whenever I thought of teaching older adult students, it made me really nervous.
Between the two of us, we currently have students ranging in age from 4 years old to 76 years old. And as we spent time talking about our lesson experiences with our various students, we started to realize how differently we use language when explaining concepts to people from different age groups. So we thought it would be fun to go through a few basic musical concepts and discuss how we would teach them to students of different ages. We hope that this will give you some things to think about if you're considering teaching a new age group for the first time.
So for this session, we will go through some common musical concepts we teach, like dynamics, articulation, rhythm, form, scales, and phrasing. We have split up our age categories into young, adolescent, young adults, and older adults. And of course, we know that every student is very different, and it's always quite tricky to put students into categories based on age. But we are hoping to provide some general ideas that will act as a jumping off point for you as you consider taking on a new student in one of these age categories.
In our experience, we have found that effective language for each group relies on a few key elements. Please keep in mind that this is definitely not a rule book, but just some things that we've noticed over the years and are using to frame this presentation today. Young students learn the best when they are entertained, so we tend to use dynamic and engaging language with instruction that relates to their existing knowledge. You're less likely to need to entertain your adolescent students or teenage students, but they do tend to need a why for most things. So our instruction is streamlined and tangible while fitting small concepts into a bigger picture. Adolescents also tend to find breaking habits to be very challenging, so consistent execution is an important part of instruction. With young adults, everything should be practical and produce an immediate result. Younger adults have very little patience and do their best with what is most convenient and what's easily understood and executed. Older adults, on the other hand, have patience in abundance and enjoy taking the time to understand concepts and express their thoughts about them. This includes knowing facts, techniques, and even the history behind each of these concepts. For this group, knowing and understanding is more important than executing consistently.
When we first learn dynamics with young students, have them whisper piano or shout forte and make really big gestures to make it fun and perhaps even funny. If they're a little shy, you can have them pick an animal that makes soft sounds like a cat and an animal that makes loud sounds like a lion, and have them meow and roar and just have fun with it. Then have them apply them to the piano and, have fun with it.
It's not very cool to do animal sounds when you're a teenager, but when we first learn dynamics, I'm always careful not to use the words force, pressure, or strength for forte. Older kids like the idea of banging on the piano already, and they will be able to figure out forte without any more encouragement. Once we put dynamics into music, we always do them the first time. Somehow, once teenagers learn something one way, it's very difficult to change it. So I'm extra careful to bring attention to each dynamic marking, and I will ask them why they think it's there. There's lots of creative reasons that they can come up with, and maybe even a story or an action. I had one student compare forte to Thor and piano to Loki, and it helps them to remember to play the correct dynamics later.
When we first learn dynamics with young adults, we talk about how to physically execute it first. The idea of soft and loud is really straightforward for adults, but doing it isn't always straightforward. I usually ask them first how they think they should play loud or soft, then try to keep instruction as basic as possible, like push the key down slowly for piano and quickly for forte. No muscles needed. Doing that provides some instant gratification and is easy to understand. Then we can put it into exercise format in order to hone that specific skill.
With older adults, we also talk about how to physically do it, but with the added discussion of why pushing down the key slower makes it softer. What is happening inside of the piano? Most of the time for older adults, just knowing the concept is enough, and recognizing the symbols in the music. Execution sort of comes and goes, but reminders about dynamics at different points during their learning of a piece will bring little spurts of joy as they remember that they know how to do that.
The simplest form of articulation that young students encounter are staccatos, legatos, and accents. For very young students, I like to use the shoes metaphor. I tell them that their fingers are feet and the keys are shoes, so that they have to keep their fingers on the keys at all times. Have them get up from the piano and start hopping like a bunny, walking around the room very smoothly, or even doing air kicks like accents. Then have them relate it back to the different articulations on the piano. And for students who are a little bit older, probably older than 6, I like to play an example and have them use their imagination to relate it to what they encounter every day and in their lives. Staccatos might look like knocking on a door. Legatos might look like when they're sliding across the room with socks on. And accents might be car honks when they're in the car and they jump suddenly. After that explanation, you have them try to replicate their description on the piano. Remind them of their analogies when it's necessary. You can brainstorm some of these ideas with them. They're more likely to remember the articulations with the prompts that they come up than the ones that you tell them.
When teaching articulation to adolescents, I love using the pencil trick shown here when teaching legato. They tend to enjoy doing something away from the piano and watching me drop my pencil when I don't connect my 2 fingers. Teenagers also typically do all kinds of sports and extracurriculars that you can draw from when describing articulations. Basketball dribble for staccato, or painting for legato. With younger adults and older adults, it's very similar. And they like the most convenient thing, so the pencil trick is great when teaching legato, as well as the explanation of not lifting the finger that is playing until you have played the next finger. Very practical and straight to the point. Staccato doesn't need much description, aside from lifting the finger as quickly as possible. You also have some freedom in deciding the technique that will be easiest for them to execute. Another technique you're most likely to encounter are slurs and the concept of ending slurs. I like to start simple with the 2-note slurs and tell them it is a cause and effect and not just cause. The gesture you make playing slurs causes the sound of the first note to be louder than the second. You can tie this in with the phrasing later.
Steady tempo can be hard to teach sometimes, especially to younger students who haven't quite figured out metronomes yet. I like to remind them that music has a heartbeat just like them, and have them imagine if their heartbeat suddenly paused for a really long time, or slowed down, or sped up at random times. That would mean something's wrong with you. And they usually enjoy that analogy a lot. Another challenge you might run into is switching from counting individual notes to counting within a time signature. Starting with understanding the concept of where the beats go, we like to use technology to aid us here. You can write out general beats and ask where the beats will go. Does it go here or does it go here? It is no longer 1, 1, 1, 1, but it's 1, 2, 3, 4. It's a simple yet very effective exercise. If they get confused counting, it's always helpful to count an empty measure beforehand. Anything that kids can see while you explain concepts to them will allow them to better understand it. This way, they also know how to write beats onto their own scores too.
When discussing rhythm with any students that are not very young, it's easiest to start with the beat. They know lots of music already and are probably familiar with clapping, tapping, or even headbanging along with a song that they like. So I find it most effective to start there and introduce the quarter note as merely the symbol that represents that beat that they are clapping. Breaking it down even further, I would use practical language that says, whenever you see this symbol, it means to play a note. And each of the different notes tells us that we need to hold it for a certain length. 1, 2, whole notes, 4. No frills needed.
For very young kids, the pieces they're going to encounter are likely to be ABA or in question and answer phrases. Start out by having them examine the score for patterns and drawing an icon or symbols they like in front of the lines that are similar, shown here on the left. They'll easily be able to see how the music is structured, making it easier to learn, especially for those longer pieces and for those students who don't necessarily enjoy learning new pieces. You can say, hey, look, you only have to learn 3 lines of music. For question and answer phrases, draw brackets on the question and brackets on the answer. Have them examine why it's a question and why it's an answer. I like to have them listen to the sound of my voice. When I ask the question, does my voice go up? Was the pizza good? And when I say a sentence or an answer, my voice goes down. Oh yes, the pizza was good. Then have them examine whether it's parallel or contrasting. I like to have them do it or guide them through the process so that they can develop self-efficacy and sufficiency.
For adolescent students, learning form can be pretty motivating, especially if it means that their really long 2-page piece is actually only AABA. Usually I try to make it a game where you find patterns in the music and encourage them to think of the piece as a puzzle. A lot of my adolescent students are motivated to find the music that matches what they already know, because then they're that much closer to finishing their piece. Beyond that, my adolescent students tend to cue into how the feeling of the music changes for each section. And we talk about form in those terms. How does a section feel compared to the other one? Is it more exciting? Is it more sad or more happy? For adult students, I frame the concept of form as how the music is put together, like a blueprint or a map. The basics are finding patterns, and similarly to teaching an adolescent student, understanding the character changes. Beyond that, we also have to talk about how the characters of the different sections fit into each other. Because most adult students will know how to sectionalize long pieces pretty easily, they're at a stage where they can begin to learn to see the bigger picture and understand how it all fits in together to unify the piece.
The most common way to teach scales for young students is through the extension of 5-finger patterns. Whenever I tell them the notes in the scale go up 1 whole octave, but they can only use one hand to play it, they get really excited to learn how. I start by having them move their thumbs in all directions to let them know that they don't need their elbows to pass under or cross over, and then go from there.
For adult students, and adolescence, I would explain the theory behind scales or the science of them, knowing that music exists in worlds or keys, and that the scales make up the notes that live in those worlds. Then explaining the scale pattern for major, seen here, or minor. They're happy to realize that they now know how to build every single scale they could possibly want to. Once they understand scales, you can explain further the circle of fifths, how key signatures are related to one another. Major keys relative minor, the order of sharps and flats, and all the good stuff. They want to know and are interested in how things are constructed. By understanding it, they are more likely to internalize scales and easily apply them to pieces that they learn.
When students are young, I try not to emphasize too much on tone production, but more that they're playing confidently and feeling comfortable at the piano, playing different dynamics. I do like to emphasize that we don't need much to create a forte sound on the piano, and emphasize finger movement rather than arm movement when I can. Young students are more likely to enjoy their piano lessons if they can still be somewhat physically active. A lot of them are fidgety at the piano and like to do big dramatic gestures while they play. I like to give them the freedom to do that, but slowly fix what I can little by little. They'll eventually grow out of it, and you can focus more on tone production later. You can still talk about phrasing, though. I like to teach my students from a young age to finish phrases off nicely, like when we say things politely in real life. You don't want to say, "I like an apple." You want to say it nicely and politely. "I'd like an apple, please." Just like that.
With adolescents, I have found that a similar approach that focuses on confident and comfortable technique at the instrument is important. At this age, they are likely able to discern between harsh tone and beautiful tone. However, I tend to not take it further than this. We practice making bad sounds and good sounds, and identifying which movements create which, then implementing them in their pieces. Teenagers are learning about grammar and sentence structure in their classes at school, so I like to talk about phrasing in these terms, helping them to put words with their music, or using the lyrics in their method books, if they're using them. If I can get them to say the words, figure out which ones are the most important, or have the most stress or meaning, and then pretend that their fingers are the ones saying the words, they tend to enjoy the process, and they'll subconsciously repeat it on their own.
With adult students, I like to get their input on what they think a good tone or phrasing is. And in order to do so, I will do it first, taking a passage that we are working on and play it a couple different ways and ask how they would describe the tone of my sound and how that tone affects the phrasing on that particular passage. And in order for them to really understand the process, I then have them play the phrase a couple different ways on their own. It might include adjusting the weight of their arm and their body or the movement of their wrist. For phrasing, I would take a similar approach of pairing lyrics to music, however, using more complex language that describes the mood of the piece or passage as well. Adults tend to respond well to more artistic or deep descriptions of music. We can talk about direction, shaping, style, and beyond that. And whether or not they can execute these things, it is meaningful for them to understand and appreciate what they are playing.
Well, we covered a lot in such a short amount of time. Thank you so much for joining us. We know that all of you wonderful teachers out there have tons of strategies for teaching the concepts that we went through today. But we hope that this session provided some ideas and some confidence boosters for teachers who are starting to teach a new age group and are looking for resources that will help them to structure their teaching and instruction approach appropriately.
If you have any questions or want to share your ideas with us, we would love to hear from you. This MTNA virtual conference is such an amazing way for all of us to share our experiences and learn from each other. So please feel free to reach out. Our emails and social medias are right there. We are looking forward to seeing the creative and inspiring presentations by all our colleagues this week. Best wishes for a great rest of the year. Bye.
Bye-bye.